Thank you very much, everyone, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for the speakers who preceded me. I'm just about to share my screen. I would very much like to thank the organizers of this very important webinar for allowing me to give this presentation, and also for getting this wonderful group of people here today. My presentation will center around two very important trade arrangements. That is specifically the African Growth and Opportunity Act. That is the main subject, but to support it, we'd also like to look at the GSP, which preceded the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. Okay, so let me just get my presentation up. Thank you. Could I ask Giselle if she could share it? I'm not able to share screen for some reason.
No problem.
I can try again. Let me just try again. As I'm getting ready to share the screen, I'd also like to state that much as AGOA is expected to end in 2 years' time, it has achieved tremendous benefits for many of the African countries that have actually taken advantage of it. And my own country of Kenya being one of them. And I was one of those lucky people who was involved in the trade ministry under the APZA before AGOA was actually implemented in 2000. And we're part of the teams that worked together with the US teams to try and finalize the preparations for the passing of the AGOA legislation. Thank you very much. So next slide, please. And we were very pleased that many African countries were able to establish themselves under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and were able to provide incentives and business operating and business support systems to enable enterprises to take advantage of the tariff preferences that had been offered by the US Congress under a bipartisan arrangement under AGOA. Next slide, please. Okay, so, as I mentioned, we're going to talk mainly about AGOA, but we'll also cover a bit of GSP. In terms of what AGOA is an enhancement of the existing US GSP scheme, and it provided opportunity for economic growth in various sub-Saharan African countries through trade with the US, and basically looking at how to enhance economic development in these beneficiary countries in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, through trade, and of course related to that investment. AGOA gave additional preferences over and above the existing general systems of preference scheme, and these were targeted at offering sub-Saharan African countries extra additional market access over and above what GSP provided. Next slide, please. So looking at the GSP, what essentially is the GSP? GSP is an international, well-established international trade preference program adopted in many countries where advanced economies provide tariff preferences, usually duty-free entry of products into their markets, with the intention that this will provide an incentive for economic development through trade, manufacturing, production, and all the other related activities that are entailed in countries joining or embedding themselves into the global value chain. And US actually has the largest and the oldest GSP system in the world, or scheme in the world. So let's look at the GSP scheme. And when we cover the GSP, we'll come specifically to AGOA. So essentially, the GSP program provides non-reciprocal. By what I mean by non-reciprocal, it's not expected that the offering country or the country advancing the GSP preferences expects a similar access to the market as you would in a negotiated trade agreement. So essentially, it's a not one-sided, but it's a unidirectional program, which enhances the capacity of these countries to export and trade, and thus improve their economic development. And this is through duty-free treatment for selected imports, from the eligible developing country into the developed country. So essentially, GSP does catalyze economic development in the developing countries through this trade. And currently we have over 20 countries having GSP programs, including countries like Japan, Switzerland, New Zealand, and others, of course, with the US. Next slide. In terms of figures or impact, currently we have 117 beneficiary countries under the US GSP system. The US GSP was established in year 1974 and came into operation the following year in 1975. And it had been reauthorized on a cycle of about 2 to 3 years, 14 times, and it expired in December 2020. The GSP benefits are conferred on specific eligible articles as defined in the tariff codes, which are imported into the US, having been deemed to originate in the beneficiary developing country. And each of you who are in the export business or facilitating exporters, you'll be able to see whether the current products that you produce were at least once eligible for GSP under the US, and possibly, hopefully, when it's renewed, will also continue to be eligible. There are approximately 3,500 products, and these are defined by the 8-digit tariff rate under the US harmonized tariff schedule. This is a schedule of tariffs for different products defined by an 8-digit code, under which you'll be able to check your particular product and find out whether it's AGOA or even GSP eligible. We have two types of countries that are eligible. We have the developing countries who are beneficiary developing countries, and then we also have the lesser or least developed beneficiary developed countries. So we have two of these schemes. We have the BDCs and we have the LBDCs, of which the BDCs enjoy about 3,500 products being duty-free, and the others enjoy 1,500 products being duty-free. If you look at the top exporters under GSP, by the time it ended in 2020, there was Thailand as the top exporter, followed by Indonesia, Brazil, Cambodia, and Philippines. You'll notice there weren't any African countries in the top list. And in terms of products, the major products were travel goods, handbags, and cases. Then we had jewelry made of precious metals and various other components. Of course, apparel was not amongst them. Next slide, please. So in terms of the figures, GSP figures, we have 119 beneficiary countries able to export to the US under the GSP. Of these, 102 are independent states, 17 are non-independent countries and territories. And then we also have a cluster of 6 associations of countries treated as one country. Of these countries, then we have 44 least developed countries. That's what you call the least developed BDCs. In addition, we also have products which are eligible for GSP. And GSP is directly intended to support exports from developing countries, while at the same time not hurting the existing American manufacturers. So it's apparent that import-sensitive products were excluded under the GSP, and these included products like apparel, textiles, watches, footwear, and so on. And you'll see later these products were subsequently added into the AGOA legislation as eligible products. And secondly, when the products are being added, and there's a process for petitioning to add additional eligible products, countries who are exporters or even importers like US importers can apply to the USTR to have a particular product added. But this must take place in consultation with stakeholders, particularly affected manufacturers in the US, before such a decision is made. Incidentally, there was an increase in the eligible products in 2015, where certain luggage, travel articles were added to the eligible list. These were previously classified as being sensitive items. Next slide, please. In terms of country eligibility for GSP, there are quite a few criteria which are used, and I wouldn't go through the list there. But in general, the GSP eligibility list is like a negative list. These are the things you basically must not do. So for instance, it's not eligible for communist countries other than members of the WTO or members of IMF. And countries which want to be eligible must not engage in activities injurious to the United States commerce. Anybody who's been expropriating or nationalizing US property, property of citizens or corporations will not be eligible. And anyone who has not been enforcing or recognizing arbitral awards will not be eligible, and so on and so forth. So there are various criteria which were used by the US government to determine who is eligible for GSP benefits as a developing country. In terms of the eligible sub-Saharan African countries, who are a subset of those BDCs you saw earlier, we have 46 countries. And of those 46, 30 are what you call least developed BDCs. And you can see the list there. The ones in blue are from the target group that I think would be attending this webinar. Next slide. So in terms of exports under GSP, are there limitations? So the answer, yes, there is. There's a concept which was introduced called the competitive need limitation. And these are the quantitative ceilings on GSP benefits for each product within a BDC. So if it's a particular country, they will have a CNL for a particular tariff line. The tariff, for that particular tariff, the CNL is reached when they have exceeded a particular ceiling. And that ceiling has two aspects. One is in terms of value of US imports from that country exceeding 50% of the total US imports for that product in a calendar year, or else US imports from that country exceed a particular value defined in the legislation. In this case, in the year that it expired, it was $195 million in year 2020. And the CNL, however, does not apply to the least developed countries, neither does it apply to countries benefiting under AGOA. So yes, it does provide also for if a country is deemed to be sufficiently competitive, this one of the criteria would be that they have actually exceeded the competitive needs limitation, which means that they're actually able to trade maybe without those tariff benefits. Okay, so what are the criteria for importing the specific products from the GSP country into the US? So first of all, under GSP, the product must be an eligible article, part of the 3,500 plus 1,500 I discussed earlier. It must be imported directly from a BDC. So there's a definition of what that means. And other criteria may also include that the product must be an article growth or manufacture of the BDC and must also meet the value added criteria. In addition, as the product is being documented in terms of export documentation, then they must use the applicable codes. I won't go into those because you can read those for yourself later. Next slide, please. In terms of value addition, one of the requirements that is that the product should either be wholly grown, produced, or manufactured in the BDC, or it should have been substantially transformed into a new product with a new and different article of commerce. So you see these, I would say these rules of origin are not as liberal in some regards, particularly in the absence of the textile provisions, which allows for a single transformation process. In terms of the value that you factor in to qualify a product to originate, there are two significant figures one must look at. The first one is the sum of the cost or value of materials produced in the BDC. And on top of that, you add the direct costs of processing of those raw materials to make the finished product. The sum of those two must equal at least 35% of the appraised value of that particular product as it reaches the US port of entry. So that's a process that will be assessed by the Customs and Border Protection on the US side, and each exporter and also the importer should have documentation to show that that product actually qualifies. Next slide, please. So this, we were talking about in shipping directly. So shipping directly has various meanings. I won't go into them, but there's a possibility that BDC can export directly to the US in a ship, in a sealed container with all the documentation, but it also can go through another BDC as long as it doesn't enter the commerce of that BDC country. It may also go through a free trade zone in a BDC. And finally, it can go through a third country, maybe where there's a port where goods are offloaded from one container consolidated into another. And in that case, it can also be shipped to the US, provided at the other end, when they reach the US, there'll be sufficient documentation to justify that product was shipped directly or imported directly into the US. Next slide. As I mentioned, we also have a graduation process. Now, graduation, quite a number of countries, well, actually 2 countries from Africa have graduated from GSP, that's Seychelles and Equatorial Guinea. And the main criteria is that they have attained a high income classification as defined by a GNI, or gross national income, exceeding 12,535 in 2019. As derived from World Bank statistics. The other criteria is that they've made significant advances in economic development and trade, and they are therefore more competitive than they were, adequately competitive so that they no longer need the tariff preferences to trade.